the Super Cassette Vision finally decides to get good on NES Works Gaiden Epoch, Episode 9. Well, let's move ahead to December 1984 and signs of what one hopes are better things to come. Lupin III. Now, Lupin III for Super Cassette Vision was not the first ever licensed console game released in Japan. Sega beat it to the punch earlier in the year with Golgo 13 and Orguss for SG-1000. And I've been informed that Bandai cloned the Emerson Arcadia 2001 in order to release 4 games based on shows like Macross and Dr. Slump back in 1982. But there's no evidence that any human being has ever actually played those games. Anyway, Lupin III for Super Cassette Vision does at least rank among the earliest home releases to tie in with an anime, and the property had a fair bit of video game cred by this point. By 1984, Monkey Punch's chaotic manga had already received 2 different television adaptations, and a third had recently begun airing on YTV, Yomiuri Telecasting Corporation. That doesn't even account for the multiple films about Lupin, including Mystery of Momo and the all-time classic Castle of Cagliostro, both of which Stern chopped up and blended together to turn into the Laserdisc Dragon's Lair-alike cliffhanger in 1983. And perhaps most significantly, Lupin III starred in an early maze action game by Taito in 1980, which appears to have been a bit of tit-for-tat. The game showed up around the same time that the second Lupin TV series featured an episode called The Invader's Safe, in which protagonist Lupin had to crack a safe by playing Space Invaders, complete with authentic sound and graphics. If you'd like to learn more about that episode, I spent about 20 minutes mulling this little collaboration in the commentary track of Discotek Media's DVD release a few years back. Anyway, that brings us to Lupin III for Super Cassette Vision, a game infused with no small amount of irony. The irony here is that it's a game about a thief by a company whose primary MO consists of swiping other companies' game concepts. And yet, it's probably the least derivative Epoch release we've seen to date. Now, at first glance, Lupin III looks like a blatant clone of Activision's Pitfall for Atari 2600. You need to traverse a linear path in a dual-level surface-subterranean space, collecting treasures, leaping over alligators, and dodging environmental hazards. But no, Lupin III is quite distinct from Pitfall. For one, it uses the incredible graphical capabilities of the Super Cassette Vision to scroll, rather than flipping from screen to screen a la Pitfall. It also only moves in a single direction. You run left to right, and you can't scroll backward. On top of that, you can't actually travel up to the surface level. The upper environment is strictly for Inspector Zenigata and his hapless cop minions to patrol and set up traps and obstacles to prevent Lupin's progress. So it's really more of a precursor to games like Super Mario Bros., a sort of hybrid between the few scrolling runners that existed to that point, namely Pac-Land and Moon Patrol. You're a cartoon character on foot, like in Pac-Land, but stumbling over the tiniest little bump or depression in the ground will bring your adventure to a swift end, like in Moon Patrol. And is that a hint of Spelunker I see here? The point is, Lupin III doesn't really set any records for originality, but it combines a lot of existing arcade concepts into a pretty solid little runner. You race through 3 subterranean spaces, hurtling over pits and barriers while doing your best to dodge random wildlife that has it in for our gentleman thief. Complicating matters, Zenigata's crew will drop random hazards into the sewer after you, such as logs, while a handful of flatfoots chase Lupin from behind. To add to the challenge, assorted treasures appear along the way, which you can collect in order to rack up a higher score. Lupin himself isn't entirely defenseless, and he can throw a mean sucker punch to take bats out of play and briefly stun cops. However, he's helpless against larger enemies, like alligators and giant serpents, unless you manage to use tools of opportunity against them, such as dislodging bombs to discourage gators from continuing their pursuit. You can also do a sort of crab walk thing by crouching as you run, or running as you crouch. It's not the most dignified way to get around, but when does Lupin ever put dignity above raw, pragmatic survival needs? All of this leads to the final stage in which you infiltrate a bank vault, or actually I guess you need to exfiltrate the vault after sneaking into it, Ocean's 11 style, by breaking in from underground. Anyway, Lupin unholsters his pistol for this challenge, blasting out a series of moving locks in order to break through the vault gates and make his way to the escape vehicle where getaway man Daisuke Jigen awaits. It's a pretty fun game that is, unfortunately, held back by the inevitable bugbear of the Super Cassette Vision. The controller, it's a mushy, unresponsive nuisance. Lupin III requires split-second timing and quick reactions, and the system's mandatory built-in joypad just is not up to the task. Something tells me this game would be a lot more enjoyable on an emulator with a proper USB or Bluetooth controller. But on original hardware, this is one caper where Lupin fails to get the best of the situation. After several underwhelming episodes on the Super Cassette Vision's early lineup, you may be wondering to yourself, why in God's name anyone would have bought this system instead of a Famicom or even an SG-1000? Well, the answer is because of Nebula, a very derivative but very good shoot-'em-up. Epoch had already explored this territory with Cassette Vision's Astro Command, a Scramble clone that attempted to do entirely too much with the limited hardware. Nebula sees Epoch dipping into the world of Scramble clones for a second time, now armed with advanced features like sufficient pixel resolution for rendering coherent sprites, and actual background scrolling, and a proper 4-directional controller. What we end up with builds on the ideas of the earlier game and plays almost like it's the midpoint between Scramble and Gradius. It lacks power-up systems, but it does have... are those Moai heads? Well, maybe, but it definitely has sarcophagi. Nebula has an Egyptian theme about it, which I suppose makes it more like a midpoint between Scramble and Life Force. Theming aside, Nebula does some interesting things in the course of its 3 stages. For starters, it doesn't just incorporate horizontal scrolling into its shooting action, it makes use of parallax scrolling, which is kind of wild. This game hit the market in December 1984, around the same time that Famicom got its first horizontal scrolling game in Excitebike, while the SG-1000 only had on offer Orguss, Golgo 13, and Flicky. And here's Epoch, doing zany graphical tricks neither of those other systems could match at that moment. The Nebula fighter itself moves with a touch of grace, banking with a detailed animation cycle, and the game throws a considerable amount of stuff around the screen at any given moment. It's quite impressive and, at least on a technical level, feels almost too good to be on Super Cassette Vision. Happily, the gameplay holds up pretty well too. Your fighter maneuvers as you'd expect for a work in this genre, and it comes equipped with both a laser and a missile that you operate with separate controller buttons in the classic tradition of Scramble and Xevious. The game adds its own personality to these standards. The missile doesn't work like a bomb. Rather than falling a fixed distance in a simple arc, it fires forward at a different vertical distance from the ship. If you simply press the missile button, it fires forward like a regular projectile, but slightly lower than your main blaster. When you hold the button, you'll cause the missile to descend from your ship until you release the button, at which point it darts forward. It takes some getting used to, and lining up shots from across the screen can be tricky, but it's a handy way to keep your ship above the scrum and out of danger while wrecking surface-level threats. The missile also requires some finesse to use, maybe a bit more finesse than the Super Cassette Vision's mushy buttons are designed to support, but that's hardly news at this point. Nebula does away with the need to manage fuel in the Scramble fashion, but that doesn't make the ground emplacements you face along the way any less of a consideration to worry about. They present a separate threat vector from the aerial attackers that pester you in waves, dividing your attention and arguably presenting a greater threat than the enemy fighter formations. Many ground forces fire arcing bombs targeted toward your current position, and the lazy flight path of those projectiles can pose a considerable threat. Worse, the bombs explode into large fire blooms like the nukes in Missile Command, filling the sky with deadly splashes of energy. Nebula doesn't have any sort of power-up system to manage, but simply evading enemies and minding the different forms of threat while wrestling with the system's fussy controller buttons proves to be plenty to deal with on its own. The game offers a steep challenge level, even on amateur difficulty, and reaching the final stage where you need to take out strange ambulatory enemies in a succession of giant sarcophagi is not a task for the faint-hearted, or for those without a high tolerance for janky controllers. Nebula admittedly doesn't offer a huge amount of variety, since the threats largely consist of ground emplacements whose behavior never really changes. But it's tough, and it throws a lot at you at any given time. Your ship has complex combat controls, and moves slowly, so you really need to pay attention to incoming threats while perfecting your instincts for lining up those missile drops. It's miles ahead of any other shooter on competing consoles at the time, and honestly compares favorably to a lot of contemporary arcade shooters. More importantly, with Nebula we finally have a Super Cassette Vision title that makes the console feel like a serious contender to the Sega and Nintendo of 1984, complete with its own innovative video tricks. Gosh, maybe the Super Cassette Vision isn't a wash after all. Next time on NES Works Gaiden Epoch, unfortunately it seems like these good games might not have been a sign of better things to come.